Unexplainable, unpredictable podcast extravaganza. The greatest podcast in the world.
Welcome back to the Unexplainable, Unpredictable Podcast Extravaganza, the greatest podcast in the world. I'm your host, Tim McCurry. I'm excited to be back, and thank you for joining me. If you're a regular listener, then you will notice some tweaks to the format. Please leave a comment and let me know what you think. In this episode, we will be diving deep into the 1970s. Here we go. The 1970s, a decade of bell-bottoms, disco balls, and some serious spiritual soul-searching. The 1970s were more than just a time of social and political change. They were a time when the very fabric of society was being rewoven. The rise of Evangelicalism, the Jesus People Movement, and the church growth movement transformed the landscape of faith, while the echoes of postmodernism, philosophy, and a burgeoning narcissistic culture began to reverberate throughout society. In this episode, we'll explore the complex interplay of faith, culture, and technology, examining how the church responded to the challenges of the time and how those responses continue to shape the spiritual landscape today. So let's set the stage. The 1970s weren't just a decade of wild parties and counterculture. This was a time when spiritual movements were booming. It felt like everyone was searching for answers, trying to figure out how faith could address the challenges of the day. Take evangelicalism. Leaders like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson were all at the forefront, leveraging the rise of televangelism to bring faith into living rooms across America. Imagine flipping through TV channels and suddenly finding Falwell and Robinson talking about God, morality, and even politics. It was a groundbreaking shift. Movements like Moral Majority rallied voters around issues like abortion, prayer in schools, family values, and fighting those godless communists of Russia. Not everybody embraced this merging of faith and politics. Concerns over separation of church and state began to grow. Theologian Francis Schaeffer warned, Christianity must never become a tool of the state or simply a political movement. Meanwhile, the Jesus People Movement was in full swing. With charismatic renewal shaking things up, figures like Lonnie Frisbee brought a countercultural vibe to Christianity, attracting young people in droves. At the same time, the church growth movement was reshaping how churches operated. Led by people like Donald McGavran, it introduced concepts like the homogeneous unit principle, essentially targeting specific demographics to grow churches. Think of it as faith meets marketing. While this approach grew congregations, critics argued it turned churches into businesses, prioritizing numbers over spiritual depth. And then there was the rise of alternative spiritualities, with increasing interest in Eastern religious figures like Chögyam Trungpa introduced Tibetan Buddhism to the West, blending deep spiritual practices with a more hedonistic edge. Especially in contrast to the conservative cultural backdrop of the 1970s America. It was all a part of what people call the generation of seekers, a wave of individuals looking for something deeper, more personal, and often unconventional. The 1970s really were the Wild West of religion and spirituality, a time of exploration, reinvention, and sometimes conflict. The issues Christians were addressing and facing were immense and complex. The very fabric of our culture was unraveling and transforming. The 1970s were more than just a decade. They were a profound season of cultural recalibration. For Christian communities, this wasn't merely a time of social change. It represented an existential challenge. In an era when everything seemed to be in motion, believers found themselves grappling with new realities. Urban decay was reshaping city landscapes. Philosophical movements began to question traditional narratives. Technology transformed not only how people communicated, but also how they understood themselves and the world around them. The ground was shifting, and the church felt it. Crime during the 1970s skyrocketed, creating widespread fear and anxiety. Violent crimes surged an astonishing 131% since 1960s, leaving cities reeling. Nowhere was this more palpable than in New York City, which teetered on the brink of bankruptcy. In 1975, the city's infamous Welcome to Fear City pamphlet warned tourists, there is a possibility that you will be a victim of crime. The message was clear. Cities had become battlegrounds of moral and physical decay. For Christians, the question arose, how do we address such brokenness while remaining true to the gospel's call to hope and redemption? At this same time, the cultural bedrock of marriage and family faced unprecedented challenges. Between 1960 and 1975, divorce rates nearly doubled, rising from 2.2 to 4.0 per 1,000 population. This was more than a statistical change, it was a seismic cultural shift. Sociologist Jesse Bernard observed this new reality. Marriage was becoming a voluntary relationship, but one fraught with unprecedented psychological expectations. Simultaneously, the sexual revolution introduced profound questions about morality, identity, and relationships. Contraceptive use among married women rose 42% in 1960 to 68% by 1975, signaling a shift in societal views towards marriage, reproduction, and personal autonomy. Coupled with this, women's labor force participation jumped from 37.7% in 1960 to 47.5% by 1975. While these changes marked significant progress for women, they also brought tensions about gender roles, family structures, and identity. For Christians, traditional family values seem under siege. How could the church articulate its vision for marriage and family in a rapidly changing world? Beneath these visible shifts lay deeper philosophical challenges. Postmodernism emerged as a pervasive critique of established systems of meaning. Philosopher Jean-François Lyotard captured its essence. Postmodernism is not a new epoch or a new way of thinking, but a perpetual questioning of all established systems of meaning. In other words, challenge everything. No truth was immune to skepticism, even religious truths. Meanwhile, Michel Foucault, observing societal transformation, redefined how power operates. Power is not something that is acquired, seized, or shared, something that one holds onto or allows to slip away. Power is exercised from innumerable points. For Christians, this philosophical shift introduced profound questions. If truth and power were no longer constants, how could the church communicate an unchanging message in a world embracing relativism? The economic realities of the 1970s were brutal. Inflation peaked a staggering 11.3% by 1979. Employment hit 9%, while real household income stagnated for the first time in generations. These economic tremors contributed to a widespread cultural anxiety. It was no accident that Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth sold over 15 million copies, becoming more than a bestseller. It became a cultural diagnostic tool. Hal Lindsey wrote, "We are the generation that will see the end of history." For many Christians, the idea of living in the end times took hold, shaping both theological beliefs and social engagement. Technology, particularly television, played a transformative role in the 1970s. Marshall McLuhan's prophetic insight, "The medium is the message," proved profoundly true. His iconic phrase suggests that the form of a medium embeds its own message, regardless of content. Television as a visual and immersive medium fundamentally changed how people process information. By the mid-1970s, 95% of American households owned a TV, with average daily viewing reaching 6.5 hours per household. Television became a dominant cultural force, shaping perceptions of reality and truth. The immersive visual nature of television contrasted sharply with the church's reliance on oral and written traditions. Fast forward to today, and the echoes of McLuhan's insight are visible, especially in platforms like TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. Bite-sized, high-impact content has redefined attention spans and information processing. Even cultural pastimes reflect this shift. Baseball, with its slow pace and long games, gave way to football, a sport tailored for television's quick, dramatic consumption. The 1970s marked the beginning of this transformation, and Christians wrestled with how to communicate enduring truths in a culture increasingly shaped by immediacy and entertainment. This wasn't just a decade. It was a philosophical and cultural earthquake, reshaping how society understood identity, community, and meaning itself. For Christians, the challenges were immense. Urban decay, family collapse, economic instability, philosophical relativism, and technological transformation converged into a moment of deep uncertainty. How could the church remain steadfast and relevant in a world that seemed to be questioning everything. In this segment, we're going to explore a new philosophical idea that was starting to emerge in the 1970s. First, let's cover our base here. It is typical now to hear postmodernism terms being thrown around, but what does that mean? If there is a postmodernism, are there modernists, and what happened before that? Philosophy encourages individuals to think deeply about life, question assumptions, and clarify their beliefs and values. It has practical application in areas like law, politics, ethics, and education, and serves as a foundation for critical thinking and intellectual exploration. In other words, philosophy is how we perceive and interact with our world and those around us. It impacts how we make decisions, how we think, how we live. You can break down philosophy into three main areas: metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Metaphysics is the stuff that keeps you up at night. Questions like, does God exist? What is time? What is space? Are we alone in the world? Epistemology is the study of knowledge. How do we know what we know? What makes something true or untrue? And ethics, what is right and wrong in the gray? What is it to live a good life? What makes actions moral or immoral? In philosophy, there are three major ways of thinking. Three major eras called pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. Each one has a different perspective on how we understand the world, how we know what we know, and how we should live our lives. Let's take a quick look at each area and discuss. Pre-modern philosophy. From roughly the 5th century BC to the 17th century AD, philosophy in the Western world was shaped by ideas from ancient Greece and Rome, as well as the influence of Christianity. This era, known as pre-modern philosophy, emphasized the existence of a higher power or a divine order in the universe. It sought to understand the world in relation to this divine reality, often relying on faith and tradition as sources of knowledge. Big names would be Plato, Aristotle, and Augustine. These people shaped how people viewed the world for centuries. Next, we have modern philosophy. Around the 17th century, a shift occurred, leading to what we call modern philosophy. Thinkers like René Descartes and Immanuel Kant emphasized reason and individual thought as the primary ways to gain knowledge. They believed in objective truth and the power of human intellect to understand the world. This era saw a rise in scientific thinking and a focus on progress and human potential. Think the scientific method. Around the mid-20th century, roughly around the 1950s and 60s, with a whole new way of thinking. A new wave of thinking called postmodernism. This movement challenged the long-held assumption of modern philosophy, questioning whether there was only one right answer to life's big questions. One of the prominent figures in this movement was Jean-Francois Lyotard, who expressed skepticism towards meta-narratives, those overarching stories that cultures use to explain the world. He suggests that knowledge and truth are relative, shaped by individual perspectives and experiences. Another influential figure was Michel Foucault, who challenged traditional notions of power. He argued that power is not merely concentrated in institutions, but operates subtly throughout society. This resonated with those who felt marginalized by societal structures. Foucault also emphasized the importance of questioning everything, stating, "My point is not that everything is bad, but that everything is dangerous. If everything is dangerous, then we always have something to do." This call for critical engagement and activism became a hallmark of postmodern thought. So how did postmodern thought intermingle into the 1970s culture? How did it spread? Universities played a key role in spreading postmodern ideas. Influential academics like Michael Foucault and Jean-François Lyotard sparked discussions and debates in intellectual circles. Their writings challenged traditional notions of power, knowledge, and truth, leading to a broader questioning of established systems of thought. Next, the arts. Postmodernism influence was deeply felt in the arts, music, and literature. Artists like Andy Warhol challenged the boundaries between high art and popular culture, while the Black Mountain poets experimented with form and language, rejecting traditional artistic conventions. Musicians like David Bowie and Brian Eno embraced theatricality and challenged the norms of popular music, reflecting the postmodern spirit of deconstruction and self-expression. Next, the social and political upheavals of the 1960s and 70s, such as the Civil Rights Movement, the anti-war movement, and the feminist movement, created a fertile ground for postmodern ideas. People were questioning authority, challenging traditional values, and seeking new ways of understanding the world. Postmodernism provided a framework for critiquing power structures and embracing diverse perspectives. Postmodernism gradually spread into popular culture through films, music, and even advertising. Its influence could be seen in the rise of irony, self-reflectivity, and a blurring of the lines between high culture and low culture. Films like Blade Runner and Monty Python and the Holy Grail exemplified the postmodern tendency to blend genres, challenging traditional narratives and embrace ambiguity. Shows like Saturday Night Live and Monty Python's Flying Circus use satire and self-awareness to challenge television's conventions and comment on social norms. The rise of punk rock, with its rebellious attitude and DIY aesthetics, reflected a postmodern rejection of mainstream culture and traditional music forms. This questioning of established norms and truths had a profound impact on the spiritual landscape in the 1970s, particularly with the religious sphere, where traditional beliefs and authority were increasingly challenged, and it also set the stage for what some have called a culture of narcissism. The 1970s saw a shift in societal values, emphasizing personal success and self-gratification over community and responsibility. This change was linked to the rise of narcissistic culture, fueled by postmodernism's challenge to absolute truth and focus on individual perspectives. Narcissism in this context went beyond vanity and self-obsession. It signified a cultural shift towards self-centeredness. In the late 70s, a historian named Christopher Lasch wrote an influential book called The Culture of Narcissism. He argued that modern society was creating a generation of people who were super focused on themselves. He wasn't just talking about individual personalities. He was describing a culture shift where traditional values like community, responsibility were given away to focus on self-fulfillment, and a need for constant validation. Lash attributed the rise of narcissism to several interconnected factors. He argued that the breakdown of traditional family structures and the rise of divorce and single-parent households contributed to a decline in parental authority and a weakening of the bonds between parents and children. This, he believed, created a sense of insecurity and instability in children, leading them to seek validation and a sense of self-worth through external sources. Lash also argued that the increasing emphasis on material possessions and consumerism fostered a culture of superficiality and instant gratification. This, in turn, encouraged narcissistic tendencies by promoting self-absorption and a focus on acquiring external validation through material goods and societal status. Lash believed the pervasive influence of television and other forms of mass media contributed to a culture of fleeting images and superficiality. This constant bombardment of images and messages made it difficult for individuals to develop a stable sense of self and fostered a reliance on external validation and approval. Lash also criticized the growing emphasis on self-help movements in psychotherapy, which he saw as a reinforcing narcissistic tendencies by encouraging self-absorption and a focus on individual needs and desires. He argued that this therapeutic culture often pathologized normal human emotions and experiences, contributing to a sense of fragility and a need for constant external reassurance. In essence, Lash saw the rise of narcissism as a consequence of a broader social and cultural shifts that undermine traditional sources of identity and meaning, leading individuals to seek validation and self-worth through external sources. Lash gave 9 characteristics of the new narcissism. I've reframed them in such a way that we can walk through them in a more modern context. Anxious and not guilty. The influencer who constantly seeks validation through likes and followers, driven by a need to prove their worth. In a religious context, this would be the religious leader who preaches a prosperity gospel, focusing on material blessings and personal gain as signs of God's favor, rather than emphasizing spiritual growth, community, and social responsibility. On a business sense, the entrepreneur who is obsessed with distribution and personal branding, prioritizing their own image and success over the well-being of their employees or the ethical implications of their business practices. Imagine a young pastor in the 1970s grappling with declining church attendance. Instead of focusing on traditional sermons about community and sacrifice, he starts incorporating self-help techniques and promises of material wealth into his teachings, mirroring the growing consumerism and therapeutic culture Lash criticized. Number 2, this person is unsure of themselves. In a social media context, this would be the person who constantly reinvents their online persona, adopting different trends and identities to fit in it. In a religious context, this could be the individual who jumps from one spiritual practice to another, seeking a sense of belonging and identity in fleeting trends rather than developing a deep understanding of any particular tradition. Number 3, superficial tolerance, fierce competition. The social media user who preaches inclusivity online but engages in subtle put-downs and comparisons. In a religious context, the religious group that claims to be accepting of all but subtly excludes those who don't conform to their specific beliefs and practices. Number 4, sexually liberated, but unfulfilled. The individual who embraces casual relationships and hookup culture but struggles to find genuine intimacy. With a religious context, the person who uses religious beliefs to justify their pursuit of multiple partners while neglecting the emotional and spiritual aspects of relationships. On a business context, the executive who engages in extramarital affairs and exploits power dynamics in the workplace while maintaining a facade of family values and ethical conduct. Number 5, they crave approval and fear competition. The person who constantly boasts about their accomplishments on social media but avoids real challenges. The religious leader who seeks validation through the size of their congregation and their public image but avoids engaging in theological debates or challenging their own beliefs. Or the manager who takes credit for their team's success but avoids taking risks or tackling difficult projects that might expose their limitations. Number 6, they preach teamwork, but they hide selfish desires. The colleague who emphasizes collaboration online, but always puts themselves first. The religious figure who preaches about humility and service, but secretly seeks power and personal gain. The executive who talks about teamwork and employee empowerment, but makes decisions that benefit themselves at the expense of their workers. Imagine a successful businessman in the 1970s, the epitome of the self-made man. He attends self-improvement seminars, preaches the importance of teamwork, and projects an image of success and confidence. However, behind the scenes, he engages in cutthroat business practices, exploits his employees, and prioritizes his own wealth and status above all else. This illustrates the disconnect between outward appearances and inner motivations that Lash identified in the new narcissist. Number 7, rules don't apply to them. The celebrity who advocates for social responsibility but flouts rules and regulations. The religious leader who preaches moral principles but engages in hypocrisy and abuses their authority. The wealthy individual who evades taxes and exploits legal loopholes while publicly advocating for law and order. Number 8, need for instant gratification. The individual who prioritizes immediate pleasures and material possession over long-term goals. The person who seeks instant spiritual enlightenment through superficial practices rather than engaging in long-term spiritual discipline and self-reflection. Or the company that prioritizes short-term profits and shareholder value over long-term sustainability and ethical consideration. Number 9, this person is also stuck in the present. The person who is constantly chasing the latest trends and experiences with no sense of the bigger picture. The religious group that focuses on contemporary interpretations of faith while neglecting the historical and theological foundations of their beliefs. The company that chases short-term market trends without considering the long-term consequences of their actions on the environment or society. Lash's book describes a way of life that is dying, the culture of competitive individualism, which in its decadency has carried the logic of individualism to the extreme of a war of all against all. The pursuit of happiness to the dead end of a narcissistic preoccupation with the self. So far, we have explored postmodernism, narcissism, and an overview of the church and what they were going through. Now let's explore another unique area that many might not think of and it's the rise of consumer technology. First off, let me say this is not about how technology is wicked or evil or bad. My hope is to point out how technology or mediums influence how culture acts and thinks. In his book, Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man, Marshall McLuhan coined the phrase, "The medium is the message." The medium is the message means that the form of communication has significant impact on how communication is received and understood. Sometimes even more so than the actual content of the message. It encourages us to pay attention to the ways in which different media shape our experiences and our world. So what is a medium and how does that connect to technology? McLuhan explains it in this way. He saw media as an extension of our own senses, our bodies, and our minds. For example, the wheel extends our feet, allowing us to travel faster and farther. The book extends our memory and allows us to share knowledge across time and space. The computer extends our brain power and allows us to process information more efficiently. This includes not only electronic technologies like television and the internet, but also older technologies like the printing press, the alphabet, and even clothing. McLuhan also considered the media to create environments that shape our perceptions and experiences. For example, the environment created by electric light allows us to be active at night and changes social patterns. So what are some key characteristics of what a medium could be? Each medium has unique characteristics that influence how we process information and interact with our surroundings. Media can change our social structures, our relationships, and even our ways of thinking. While content is important, McLuhan argued that medium itself has a more significant impact than the specific content that it carries. The 1970s saw television transition from a black and white novelty item to an ambiguous color appliance, becoming smaller and cheaper. By the mid-1970s, 95% of American households owned at least one television, and the average household watched over 6 hours daily. The VCR launched in the early 1970s with a hefty price tag of $1,000 to $4,000, equivalent in today's money to $7,000 to $28,000. This was not merely a technological advancement, but it also a status symbol representing choice, control, and memory. This device transformed the relationship between viewers and broadcasters, granting viewers greater agency. In comparison, the personal computer, initially available as expensive technical kits primarily for educational purposes, became more accessible in 1977 with the release of a pre-assembled model like the Apple II. Although still a status symbol due to its high price, the PC symbolized an extension of cognitive abilities and personal empowerment. Finally, the 1970s marked the dawn of the video game industry. While the early 1970s featured arcade games, the mid to late 70s saw the emergence of home consoles like the Atari and Magnavox Odyssey. This shift from physical to digital play extended imagination and creativity, but also began to replace face-to-face interactions with digital spaces, contributing to increased isolation. Building on McLuhan's ideas, we can see that these technologies, the TV, the VCR, and the personal computer, along with video games, aren't just neutral tools. They're extensions of ourselves, shaping how we think, how we experience the world, and even how we see ourselves. But here's the thing. As we become more reliant on these extensions, as we spend more time immersed in these technological environments, something interesting starts to happen to our sense of self. It starts to fragment. That TV, with its constant stream of images and information, starts to break down our sense of unified, coherent self. We're bombarded with different perspectives, different stories, different realities. It's like our identity is being pulled in a million different directions. Even the VCR, with its promise of choice and control, can contribute to this fragmentation. Suddenly, we have so many options, so many different versions of reality to choose from. It can be overwhelming, and it can make it harder to figure out who we really are and what we believe. The personal computer, while empowering in many ways, also starts to isolate us, to create these individual bubbles where we interact with the world through a screen. It's a fragmentation of community, a fragmentation of shared experiences. And those video games, while fun and imaginative, can also lead to a kind of fragmentation. This fragmentation of self is deeply connected to the ideas of postmodernism and narcissism. The constant exposure to different perspectives and the breakdown of traditional narratives echoes the postmodernism rejection of a single, unified truth. And the focus on individual choice, control, and experience aligns with the narcissistic tendency to prioritize the self. It's all coming together to create a new kind of person, a new kind of culture, one that is increasingly fragmented, individualized, and uncertain about its place in the world. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Unexplainable, Unpredictable Podcast Extravaganza. We have journeyed through a decade grappling with spiritual and cultural identity. We have reviewed a society that was trending towards narcissism and how mediums and technology can reflect how we are thinking. Join me next time for part 2, as we'll analyze some of the church's responses and how they have had a lasting impact on us today.
Thank you for listening to the Unexplainable, Unpredictable Podcast Extravaganza, the greatest podcast in the world.